monitoring our expenses, etc., etc. Property, that's another form of stewardship. There's stewardship of money, there's stewardship of real estate, property, buildings, grounds, etc. And then ministries of helps or service. Now you look at the institution of the diaconate, you find it in Acts 6. You remember where there were these widows, these Grecian widows, that were being overlooked. And the disbursement, remember the word distribution? You had doctrine, you had discipline, and you had distribution. They were being overlooked in the distribution piece of the life of the church. And so the Peter and the other apostles said, look out from among you and select men of good repute, and gave the various qualifications. And the people were involved in selecting them. Now the difference between overseers and deacons, or elders and deacons, is clearly seen even in another passage like Philippians 1, verse 1. As Paul is addressing the church at Philippi, he speaks to overseers and deacons, mentioning them separately, as they are listed separately in their qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. There's a section in Louis Berkhof's Systematic Theology which is so insightful. I've copied it and dropped it in your notes there, talking about the impact of the diaconal office in charity and welfare, even in society, both inside the church and outside the church. He says there, the Lord clearly intended that the church should make provision for her poor. He hinted at this duty when he said to the disciples, "For you have the poor always with you." And he saw to it that no one wanted the necessities of life in Acts 4:34, which says, "There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold to the apostles." So there can be no doubt about the duty of the church in this respect, and the deacons are the officers who are charged with the responsible and delicate task of performing the work of Christian benevolence with reference to all the needy of the church. They must devise ways and means for collecting the necessary funds, have charge of the money collected, and provide for its prudential distribution. However, their task is not limited to this offering of material help. They must also instruct and comfort the needy. In all their work, they should consider it their duty to apply spiritual principles in the performance of their duty. Now, this is the part I really wanted to highlight. It is to be feared that this function of the church is sadly neglected in many churches today. There's a tendency to proceed on the assumption that it can safely be left to the state to provide even for the poor of the church. But in acting on that assumption, the church is neglecting a sacred duty, is impoverishing her own spiritual life, is robbing herself of the joy experienced in ministering to the needs of those who suffer want, and is depriving those who are suffering hardships, who are borne down by the cares of life, and who are often utterly discouraged of the comfort, the joy, and the sunshine of the spiritual ministrations of Christian love, which are, as a rule, entirely foreign to the work of charity administered by the state. What is the great problem and defect in what the state does in its social welfare system? It's a lack of relationship.
People are made to participate, whereas in the church, it's because they want to.
Exactly. So, I think that look at the things that he's talking about there. He's talking about Christian love and so forth coming with, it's not just throwing money at it. I mean, that you come with relationship. Yes, you provide means and wherewithal, but there's a whole package involved there in the relational component. Deacons don't just kind of, keep the checkbook and disperse the funds and, a little money here and a little money there. No, they are minister. In fact, the word deacon means minister. It's the most basic core word for service or ministry that there is in the New Testament. Well, let's look at a couple more things that relate to both elders and deacons. The concept of representative rule. Who actually appoints? When you look at Acts chapter 1, after Judas and his sin, and they were replacing Judas, they put forward two, Joseph Barsabbas, or Justus, and Matthias, and they cast lots. There was a kind of voting that took place, a weird kind of voting. But in Acts 6, verse 3, it says, pick out from among you. In other words, you pick them, which they did. And by the way, every one of them were Grecian boys. They had Greek names because it was the Grecian widows. So they picked from their own crowd, people that they knew and trusted that would have their interest at heart. In Acts 14, it says of Paul that he appointed elders in every church, having set them apart with prayer and fasting. That sounds like the apostle chose the elders, doesn't it? However, the word appoint there is the word charitoneo, which means to elect by a show of hands. That's actually what the word means. It was a common procedure in the Greek city-state when they elected certain functionaries or persons for certain roles. So there you clearly have the idea of the people engaged in the selection of, so that's why we have an officer election. But we also have the session dynamically involved in the process of training and equipping. That's why we're doing this. It's why the session labors over and prays over the list of nominees first to make sure that we feel that, best we can tell, these guys are probably fit the qualifications of 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. So there was a lot of talk about you guys before I ever picked up the phone and called you and said, hey, here's what's happened. What do you think? What's God doing in your heart? So it's quite a dynamic process. Then ordination, a couple of places in the book of church order that kind of capture that biblical teaching about church orders, or the doctrine of vocation, sometimes called. Ordinary vocation to office 16:1 says, in the church is the calling of God by the Spirit through the inward notice these pieces. The inward testimony of a good conscience, the manifest approbation of God's people, and the concurring judgment of a lawful court of the church. So there you've got it. Session, people, and then what God is doing inwardly in the heart of the person. And the three are working together in this calling to office. The government of the church is by officers gifted to represent Christ, and the right of God's people to recognize by election to office those so gifted is inalienable. Therefore, no man can be placed over a church in any office without the election, or at least the consent of the church. Upon those whom God calls to bear office in his church, he bestows suitable gifts for the discharge of their various duties, and it is indispensable that besides the possessing the necessary gifts and abilities, natural and acquired, everyone admitted to an office should be sound in the faith and in his life according to godliness. Wherefore, every candidate for office is to be approved by the court by which he is to be ordained. And then ordination itself, this is, y'all pretty much understand this, but this is the section where it's laid out in chapter 17. Those who've been called to office in the church are to be inducted by the ordination of a court. Ordination is the authoritative admission of one duly called to an office in the church, accompanied with prayer and the laying on of hands, to which it is proper to add the giving of the right hand of fellowship. As every ecclesiastical office according to the Scripture is a special charge, no man shall be ordained unless it be the performance of a definite work. Now, one last point is kind of interesting because it brings out some uniqueness of the PCA. Remember, we were talking about that a little bit, Bob? And that is this principle of the relative autonomy of the local church. The PCA is probably the most grassroots Presbyterian denomination in the history of Presbyterianism. And what do I mean by that? There was a very deliberate attempt in the founding of the PCA, which came out of the old mainline denomination, to apply a principle that many of the Reformed writers wrote about. And I've given you one kind of short little sampling of that with this piece from Louis Berkhof's Systematic Theology. So let's just look at that. He says, Reformed church government recognizes the autonomy of the local church. And this means at least two things. One, that every local church is a complete church of Christ, fully equipped with everything that is required for its government. It has absolutely no need of it that any government should be imposed upon it from without, and not only that, but such an imposition would be absolutely contrary to its nature. Two, that though there can be a proper affiliation or consolidation of contiguous churches, there may be no union which destroys the autonomy of the local church. Hence, it is better not to speak of classes or synods, Presbyterian General Assembly, as higher, but describe them as major or more general assemblies. They do not represent a higher, but the very same power that inheres in the session, though exercising this on a broader scale. McGill speaks of them as higher and remoter tribunals. Okay, how to fracture that out? What's that saying? What it's saying is the ecclesiastical power that's exercised by a session is no greater nor higher than the power that's exercised in the General Assembly. So the General Assembly, what happens there is a meeting of elders, just as the session is a meeting of elders. It's not like you have elders and uber elders. Both are elders, and they're related to one another in a system of courts, but one is not superior to the other. And let me give you a little homework assignment. It'll only take you 10 minutes or less. Go home and look at chapter 39, the first three sections, particularly section 3, where it unpacks what Louis Berkhof is saying here in this principle. Chapter 11, verse 3, that's there in your notes, also talks about it at the principle level. When he says all church courts are one in nature, constituted of the same elements, possessed inherently of the same kinds of rights and powers, and differing only as the Constitution may provide. When, however, according to scriptural example and needful to the purity and harmony of the whole church, disputed matters of doctrine and order arising in the lower courts are referred to the higher courts for decision, such referrals shall not be so exercised as to impinge upon the authority of the lower court. What you're going to see there is that when a matter, let's say, from a local session goes to a presbytery looks at it and reviews it, but then it passes it on to the General Assembly because they can't come to a decision on, or the action of the presbytery is challenged, let's say by a session, and it becomes an actual case in dispute, and it goes up to the Standing Judicial Commission of the entire denomination. You'll see in 39-3 that there is a tremendous amount of deference given to the action of the lower court. If there are issues that strike at interpretation of the Constitution of the entire PCA, namely the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms and the Book of Church Order, then the Standing Judicial Commission will often wade into that. But as far as facts of the case, it gives, and you'll see that word, deferring to the local court mentioned several times. And it's because of this principle that Berkhof says was actually embedded in the history of of the understanding of church government in the Reformation world, both in Europe, because Berkhoff was a Dutch Calvinist, and in Britain, that got contaminated in American versions of Presbyterianism prior to the PCA, where there were these kind of prelatical elements of hierarchicalism that developed. And when the PCA was founded, we said, we're going to go back to original Presbyterianism as it was articulated by our Scotch Presbyterian forefathers and our Reformed brothers on the continent in Europe, that saw this tremendous respect for the government of the church at its most basic level, which occurs in the local congregation. So that's why the PCA is very much of a grassroots denomination. And you don't have a kind of denominational boards and agencies that are basically running the show and the people out in the churches. That's why, for example, the denomination cannot seize the property of a PCA church, whereas in the old mainline denomination, many churches that came out of that denomination and went into the PCA or went into the ARP or the OPC or other churches like that, they lost their property because the denomination, again, kind of a hierarchical thing, exercised powers and prerogatives over the local congregation, where you'd gotten that kind of creeping hierarchicalism that undermined this principle. And it's 8:30. And we're done. That last point, I know, I took you into the weeds, a little bit deep on that one. But I think you got the gist of it, didn't you? By the way, I'm actually, I called today because I read what I had here in my notes and I said, this is not clear. So I called my buddy David Cawthon, who is the best expert on Presbyterian polity I know of in America today. And he's going to send me some stuff on this. So when I get something, if it looks like a better explanation of what I just said, I'll send it to you. All right, we have one more session. It's the 30th. We will not meet next week, obviously, because that's Thanksgiving. But we will finish. I want to congratulate you in advance. You're close. You're almost there. But you need to do giddy up. So if you've got a little bit of extra letdown time surrounding the holidays, sneak away and get caught up if you're behind on your going through the self-guided tour of the confession. And if you get caught on something like, don't struggle with it. Text me. Call me. Don't waste time, spin wheels. Let me know so that you can keep moving on it, okay? Let's close with prayer. Richard, would you lead us, please?